Hello, and welcome to What's the Deal, the investment banking series on JP Morgan's Making Sense podcast channel. I'm Rebecca Thornton, head of Director Advisory Services at JP Morgan. We've recently concluded the 13th annual JP Morgan Board Summit here in New York. The Board Summit convenes the country's leading non-executive directors to cover issues most pressing to U.S. public companies. This year, we had the opportunity to address the topics that included AI, geopolitics, the 2024 election, rates in the economy, climate awareness and literacy, corporate governance and succession planning, and concluded with remarks from our chairman and CEO, Jamie Dimon. Joining me today to discuss a few key takeaways is my colleague and co-lead of the JP Morgan Board Summit, Charlie Post. Charlie is a managing director in our U.S. Mergers and Acquisitions Group and is co-head of Media and Communications M&A at JP Morgan. Thanks for joining us, Charlie.
Thanks, Rebecca. Always a pleasure.
It's great to catch up after a busy couple of days. Before we dive into the Board Summit, could you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and what you do here at JP Morgan?
My pleasure. I've been a member of JP Morgan's M&A group for nearly 15 years and currently co-lead our Media and Communications M&A efforts. I'm also responsible for all of our U.S. sports M&A activity, a practice that we recently relaunched to drive our enhanced focus on sports acquisitions, investments, and financings. In addition to partnering with you on the Board Summit, I've also had the pleasure to co-lead the IB's MBA recruiting efforts at NYU Stern.
So with that, Charlie, why don't you share a bit more about the JP Morgan Board Summit for our audience's benefit?
I'm happy to talk about this event, especially since I've been involved with it for the last 8 years. For those who aren't familiar, the Board Summit is our flagship event that targets non-executive directors of U.S. public companies. We've started this effort 13 years ago when we realized that the role of public company directors was likely to become increasingly complex and challenging. We were really fortunate to have an incredibly diverse and capable universe of directors attend our event this year. We had nearly 200 directors attend, representing 575 unique companies and $25 trillion worth of market capitalization. Maybe most importantly, we were thrilled to have over 50% of those that joined us being female.
It really is incredible to hear those sorts of statistics, and I know you share our pride and the diversity and strength of our attendees again this year.
Absolutely.
So as you reflect on some of the learnings, takeaways, insights, what were the highlights?
We were fortunate to have a lot of really impressive people speak to us. And what really stood out to start with was the commonality across a lot of the discussions. We had 3 different sets of speakers tell us that succession is clearly the most important thing that directors should be considering in their duties. We heard our own chairman tell us that succession is discussed at every single one of our board meetings. And we heard one of our directors express the view that succession is the thing that she takes most seriously in her role as a director.
Fascinating to hear the consistency of that topic when you hear so much more about sustainability, climate, talent, workforce management. I think there's something really insightful about hearing from all different industries, all different size companies, really suggesting that if you can't get the succession plan right, none of the other stuff sort of matters.
Well, that's exactly right. I think the other thing that we heard that was really common across many of the discussions is the importance of planning, both in terms of strategy and capital for AI. And that regardless of industry, AI is going to become an important part of all business models, whether it's revenue generating for technology companies or it's cost savings for banks like our own. Clearly, AI is here to stay. We heard many of our speakers say that it's underhyped, not overhyped. And it's a duty of a director to be asking management teams, how are we planning for this? How are we planning our capital for this? And what is our long-term strategy?
One of the things that I took away from that was just the cost of competing in this environment. The cost of setting up AI companies are extraordinary, trillion-dollar market cap kind of issues.
Absolutely.
Another topic I know companies are watching closely is the 2024 election. You moderated a panel with a leading Republican Politico and a leading Democratic pundit. What were some of the key takeaways from that discussion?
Well, let me first start by saying I had a lot of fun with that discussion, so I'm glad that I had the opportunity to do that. There were a handful of things that really stood out to me in their remarks, and while they sat on different sides of the aisle, it was interesting that they shared common views on all of these key takeaways. The first was the importance of the battleground state. And those 6 battleground states are likely to have the determining factor in the outcome of the election. And at the moment, the polls show that the races in those states are incredibly tight. And it's anyone's guess on which key factors are going to derive the win in any one of those states. The other really interesting thing they touched on was the likely impact of third-party candidates on the election. While there are many third-party candidates vying for a spot on the ballot, there's a real possibility that those candidates could have a determinative and unintended impact on the election. Lastly, they both touched on the impact of VP selection. To my surprise, the agreed view on both of these pundits was that, in fact, in the long term, the VP selection really is unlikely to have any material impact on the outcome of the election. And that's advice that actually is supported by empirical evidence.
Yeah, so much great stuff that came out of that discussion. I also found the VP selection data to be compelling from a historical perspective. We also had the opportunity to hear from our own Joyce Chang, the chair of global research at JP Morgan. What were some of her key observations?
Joyce had a number of really interesting points, Rebecca. First, she highlighted that there's a dichotomy across the U.S. consumer's balance sheet, which appears healthy at a macro level with a $47 trillion increase in household assets over the last few years. However, that increase has been increasingly uneven within the population and has mainly benefited the owners of homes and financial assets. As a result, we're seeing an increased usage of credit card debt to fund core daily expenses for lower income consumers, which is creating uncertainty within the economy over the next 12 to 18 months. She also highlighted several interesting developments in China. The negative impact of China's 26-year low in foreign direct investment is having a meaningful impact on its growth and its economy. So, Rebecca, while I've been at the event for the last 8+ years, you've been with us for 5. And one of the things that really stood out to me at this year's event is that the term ESG was used incredibly seldomly. Whereas 5 years ago when you joined us, I think that would have probably been the term du jour. So what are you hearing from your audience and your group of directors that has caused ESG and the focus on it to have changed over those last 5 years?
So ESG was certainly one of those topics that most governance geeks like me would spend time listening to CEOs and management teams figuring out how to tackle what is a really complex issue. I think that the work continues, which is to suggest that environmental, social governance is part of how all businesses should do business. Maybe we're calling it different things. It may just be table stakes to doing business today. But I would argue that ESG is just good G. Good governance includes environmental, includes social, includes climate, and making sure that you're building not only environmentally sustainable businesses, but also financially stable businesses.
Well, it's interesting you say that because our climate experts who attend really emphasized what you just said, which is that it is a fundamental duty of directors to show up to the boardroom asking the tough question, what are we doing around climate? How are we planning for it? And so while that is a part of ESG, climate, it ultimately is just good governance for a director to show up and ask the management team, what are we doing about climate and how are we preparing for it?
One of the things I loved most about that session, the data was extremely compelling, but it wasn't coming at it from any sort of political angle. It was really coming from a place of literacy. And that's the term they use, is climate literacy. And I think as business owners, as advisors, as board members, it is a responsibility to at least ask the questions. And if you're not asking the questions, you're not going to get to the right answers because there is data to suggest that the temperature rising is going to impact not just certain geographies of places you do businesses, but actually the businesses themselves.
So, Rebecca, maybe share takeaways from our own board's perspective.
I think you've done an incredible job of unpacking the themes that were front and center of our agenda. One of the things that I took away is just a renewed sense of JP Morgan's own board. We're fortunate to have a couple of the board members present, and it's the consistency of culture, diversity of backgrounds, the diversity of experiences that really lead to rich kinds of conversations in complex business environments like JP Morgan's is.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Charlie, thank you for spending this time with us and for sharing a few of the key highlights and takeaways from the board summit. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of What's the Deal? We hope you found this conversation insightful and relevant as you navigate your own board strategies. I'm your host, Rebecca Thornton. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to What's the Deal? If you've enjoyed this conversation, we hope you'll review, rate, and subscribe to JP Morgan's Making Sense to stay on top of the latest industry news and trends. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. To stay ahead of the curve, sign up for JP Morgan's In Context newsletter, packed full of market views and expert insights delivered straight to you. To subscribe, just visit jpmorgan.com/in-context. This material was prepared by the investment banking group of JP Morgan Securities LLC and not the firm's research department. It is for informational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase, sale, or tender of any financial instrument.